What is up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Before I jump in, as always, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the content I put out on YouTube every single week. Good show in store this week. Gonna talk a couple developments from the last 48 hours or so, and then a full kind of Premier League season in review. We got some awards to hand out, some teams to announce, and a look back on some of the things that I talked about at the beginning of the season and evaluating what I got right and what I got wrong. That will all be coming up. First, though, couple developments to attend to, as I mentioned. First of which is Sevilla, once again, winning the Europa League, continuing their perfect record in the Europa League final and their dominance of this competition overall. Not a particularly great game, although Roma did show some ambition early, and so you thought maybe we're not going to get a total Jose Mourinho final here. And ultimately, Paulo Dybala comes back. He's healthy enough to start. He scores. Roma looked good in the first half. No issues defensively. And you think they're just going to park the bus and probably get another 1-0 Jose Mourinho victory in a European final. However, you get some halftime substitutions from Sevilla. Suso in particular made a massive impact. They were much more dangerous in the second half. They were able to get their fullbacks, and specifically Jesus Navas, farther up the field and kind of to the end line, put in some dangerous crosses. One of them ends up in an own goal, and Sevilla just got more and more dangerous as the game went on and really were in control for most of that second half. Which is not what you expect from a Mourinho team. After those first 45 minutes, they really did not kind of have things under control defensively. And so Sevilla get their goal, could have had a second. Both teams had claims for penalties. I was very happy with the way that all played out. I think ultimately they got both those calls right. And so you go to extra time and nothing happens except for the little scuffle involving Mourinho. More yellow cards are handed out. It seems like every Roma player and coach had one by the end of this game. And eventually this ends the only way it can end, when the unbeatable force meets the chosen one in a European final, which is a penalty shootout. And it is Sevilla, obviously, who prevail. Gonzalo Montiel. Talk about a 6-month period for him. He converts the winning penalty in the World Cup. And now, after missing the first one and getting a second opportunity, converts the winning penalty kick to take this Sevilla team into the Champions League next season and to win a Europa League title. Congratulations, Gonzalo Montiel. Doesn't get much better than that. And look, there's not much to break down in this game. It was about what you expected. Yes, it's interesting that Roma had the game plan and it went the way Jose Mourinho wanted, and Sevilla found a way to fight back and kind of mess that up in the second half. But there's really just one thing I want to get to here. And that is the manager of the Sevilla team, Jose Mendilibar. Trying to figure out how to pronounce his name. I believe that is how you do it. Mendilibar. Jose Mendilibar, before this run, had managed one game in a European competition, if I did my research correctly, and that was as manager of Athletic Bilbao in the Intertoto Cup. I believe they lost to a Romanian team. I don't remember off the top of my head who it was, but it was not a high-profile team. And Mendilibar has made his career basically, trying to get teams promoted from the second division, trying to prevent teams from getting relegated from La Liga. And that's what he walked into at Sevilla. This was a team trying to avoid relegation. Don't forget how badly the season started for him. And you got a couple higher profile managers, it doesn't work. So they turned to Mendel, and not only does he do the job in La Liga, they're comfortably mid-table, not a great season, but nowhere near the catastrophe it could have been. And now he's got him in the Champions League too, and he continued the proud history in the Europa League. And to do this is the other part of it that's fascinating. Think about this. To make this happen, this Sevilla team, managed by this guy again, who has made his living with teams that you don't pay attention to. And quite frankly, I don't either, for the most part. He had to go and basically no European experience before he got this job. One game, if I'm doing my research correctly. First up, Erik ten Hag. Right? Champions League semifinal, seconds away from a Champions League final. Max Allegri, Champions League finals. So the level kind of goes up, right? Champions League semifinal, Champions League final. And then, of course, you get the ultimate test in Jose Mourinho, who is the only person alive to have won all 3 European competitions. And makes his name in moments like this and games like this. And Jose Mendel-Ilbar's team prevailed. There is something about this competition in Sevilla. But this was not your typical Sevilla team where they have a good season. Either they're dropping into this competition from the Champions League, or they, were the Spanish team that qualified for it, finishing 5th in the league or whatever. And you go, yeah, maybe they're not the best team in the competition, but you certainly like their chances of hanging in there. And obviously they got some kind of magic here. This is not that at all. This was a rescue mission. Because it didn't go well in the Champions League, and it wasn't going well in La Liga. It wasn't like this was the Sevilla teams of past, where you just knew they were really good. They can give teams difficulty. They're great in this competition. They just turned into that team by the end of the season. And Mendel-Ilbar deserves an immense amount of credit for that. It's a terrific story. And so I don't want that to get lost in this, Sevilla won the Europa League again. Yes. The other ones weren't like this, though. The way that this season has turned around is remarkable. And now they've got all of these good vibes, this momentum, this confidence heading into next season, where they're going to be back in the Champions League. And on the Roma side of this, they're not going to be in the Champions League, obviously. There's no door open. The question is, which European competition are they going to be in? It's probably going to be this one again. I'll get to that in the weekend roundup. But it's also just kind of this question as we begin these European finals of what do the Serie A teams do? This was probably the best shot. Because West Ham is a better team than Fiorentina on paper. And obviously Manchester City is the favorites in the Champions League. You got 3 teams there into the final. Half of these spots in the final are taken up by Italian teams. I made this point in my 5 things from the week. It's a big deal. It's a great step. You had a great opportunity to win one here. This is probably your best opportunity. You didn't take advantage. It's just kind of another thing to think about as you get ready for these other 2 finals. Because now you're going up against 2 Premier League teams. And I know West Ham haven't had a good season, but this is everything for West Ham. This is their season. And it has been for a long time, especially once they kind of turned things around and made sure they weren't going to get relegated. This is about, coming so close last season in the Europa League and not getting the job done. Now they have another opportunity. It's a lot of pressure on Fiorentina in terms of trying to go up against that. And obviously, Inter have their work cut out for them too. So it does change the story a little bit if all 3 of these teams lose, as opposed to if 2 of them won or something like that. Obviously, 2 can still win. The bigger story here is what Sevilla did and the fact that Jose Mourinho conceded a goal in a European final for the first time in 20 years and didn't win, But there's also the kind of the broader Serie A context to think about as well. Ultimately, Sevilla going back to the Champions League next season. Terrific turnaround. Congratulations, Jose Mendilibar. Phenomenal story. Not a great game, but ultimately it provided entertainment in the end, in probably about the only way a Jose Mourinho Sevilla Europa League final could. The second thing I want to touch on before jumping into Premier League stuff in segment 2 is the coaching change with the U.S. men's national team. Anthony Hudson has stepped away to take a job reportedly in the Middle East. I haven't actually seen what club it is yet. I don't know how many people actually know. There just seems to be reports that it's the Middle East. BJ Callahan. And welcome back to the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the content I put out every single week. It is Premier League season in review time. My goal here is to just kind of evaluate this season from a few different standpoints. So, what I have is a team of the season, an all-important team, manager, player of the season, and then I went back and looked at the the season preview I wrote on Substack, touchlinetalk.substack.com, where I had storylines and best and worst case scenarios for teams, and I'm going to share some of the things I got wrong and some of the things I got right from that preview and kind of the story I was laying out for this season. First, though, let's start with the teams of the season. The first one is my team of the season, the best 11, whatever you want to call it, top players in the Premier League this season. Starting in goal, I went with Alisson. Yes, you have a case for Nick Pope. I went with Alisson because he was not working with a particularly good defense most of this season. All that criticism of Trent Alexander-Arnold is a check in the box of Alisson. And, Van Dijk isn't quite the same player. Liverpool were not particularly good. Newcastle obviously had the better season. Newcastle were the better defense. I just ultimately think Alisson was a little bit more impressive. Certainly there's an argument for Nick Pope. There's probably an argument for Ederson too. And there's another reason I'm saving for Alisson that illustrates this even further, but to me I didn't have too much of an issue with this one. I feel pretty confident about Alisson. I didn't go back and forth about that very much. Then the defenders, Kieran Trippier, Sven Botman, William Saliba, Nathan Ake. Nathan Ake was playing some left back, some left center back for City, so I'm putting him at left back because he played enough there this season. He deserves to be on this team, and there weren't really any other left backs that inspired me, so that was the solution to the problem. Trippier, obviously fantastic. Newcastle so good in the back. Captain of that team, so dangerous on set pieces. Don't really need to explain that one. Botman, same thing. The Newcastle defense deserves to be recognized here. And then William Saliba. Again, I'm going to save a little bit of my argument for later. But don't forget how good he was until he got hurt. And how good Arsenal were when he was healthy. That is part of the story of the way this season unfolded. And so, it's always a tough position with the center backs because Nathan Ake was fantastic. I didn't really want to go put another City one in because they dominate the ball so much that, sometimes Ederson just gets to kind of take a break, It's not, they defend through possession so much that I'm hesitant to award too many defenders. And so you look at Newcastle as the other great defensive team in the league. And then the standout for me was Saliba. And that is how I came to my defenders list. Then we got the midfielders. Kevin De Bruyne was always going to be on this list. I've gone on and on about him. He had to be there. And Martin Odegaard also. Those two guys, outside of the kind of creative and specifically the forwards, I've categorized them as. These two guys had the most goal involvements for midfielders and defenders in the Premier League. Not surprising. I think Odegaard had 23, or De Bruyne had 23, and Odegaard had 22, if I remember correctly. They were both phenomenal. You're talking about which two attacking midfielders do you want? This wasn't hard. And then you get to the last spot. And I went back and forth a little bit. Originally, I had Rodri here, just because Rodri deserves recognition, and this is kind of how you can give it to him. But I decided to go with Moses Caicedo, because he was just fantastic. And he provides you with a combination of ball winning and progressive passing that you don't really get with Rodri. Now, part of that is the fact that, again, Manchester City always have the ball, so there's not a lot of ball winning to be done. But he's much more of a tempo setter and a passer. And Caicedo gives you plenty of that. He gives you some creativity, and he also gives you all of that work off the ball to win the ball back. So you got multiple other options here. I did have a difficult choice choosing that third guy. But ultimately, I went with Moises Caicedo. I'm just kind of biased. I love him. And also, I'm just kind of biased towards that Brighton team. They deserve to be recognized for the great season they had, and this is one way you can do it. And then the forwards. This is where I had no difficulty whatsoever. These were the three best forwards in the league. These were the three forwards that had the most goal involvements. By far. And Bukayo Saka was next. He would have been the next guy on this list for me. But it's Haaland, it's Kane, and it's Salah. Whether you want to turn this into a 4-4-2 and put De Bruyne and Salah out wide or play Harry Kane underneath Haaland, it's not perfect. I get it. I don't care. These are your best three forwards. Haaland, obviously. Salah, obviously. And, Kane, obviously. There just wasn't anybody else on these guys' level. So, no surprises, I would think, there. And that is my Premier League team of the season. Up next is the all-important team. I love doing these. The way I define this is these are the most valuable players to their teams in the league. So not necessarily the best, but the guys who are the most irreplaceable. Hence, the all-important team. In net, once again, is Alisson. This is always really hard to evaluate, but there is one number that helps tell this story, and that is your post-shot expected goals situation. Basically, how many expected goals did you save your team where the ball was supposed to go in the net and it didn't? Now, is some of that luck? Yes, but some of that is skill. Alisson's numbers from an analytical standpoint were the best in the league. And shout out to FB Ref, that's where I got all this data from. Want to give them their recognition. Significantly better than Nick Pope's. I don't always like to just look at that number and go, that's who it is. But you combine what Alisson means to this team, the fact that, again, that defense wasn't great this season, and the fact that his numbers were better, and I didn't have a difficult one with this either. On to the defense. Kieran Trippier appears again. Not too shocking. He's captain. He gives you a really dangerous part of your attack from right back. He's good defensively. They don't have anybody to replace him. And he was phenomenal. Then center backs, William Saliba. I'm a big believer in the injury should count towards the most valuable player situation. You saw what happened to Arsenal once he got hurt. He deserves to be on this team more than he does team of the season, and he deserves to be on team of the season. In terms of most important, this is where you can't put a Manchester City center back on here. There are too many of them. They are just not that irreplaceable, and he clearly was. Right? This is when City's depth work against them in terms of recognition for individual players. And the other center back is James Tarkowski. James Tarkowski played on a team that couldn't score goals. James Tarkowski blocked 29 more shots than any other player in the Premier League. And by the way, his team stayed up. Again, was he the best center back in the league? No. But his contributions were massive for Everton. And that defense had to be good because they weren't getting any support from the attack. This is why I like making an all-important team. You can include guys like him. And then I went with Purvis Estupiñán. Again, not in love with the left-back options. Nathan Ake was not making this team because City had plenty of other options there. And I'm also a huge personal fan of Estupiñán's. I was so excited when Brighton made that move. And he's another guy, kind of like Trippier, who you feel fine about defensively, but he gives you so much in attack, some assists, progressive passing, passes into the box. He was a key part of Brighton's build-up and Brighton's amazing attack this season. And I'm just not convinced you're going to go be able to find another left back on that, another outside back on that team right now who provides you what he provides you. Obviously, he was brought in to replace Marc Cucurella. But in a position where there just aren't that many guys that stand out. And honestly, the other guy I was thinking about here was Jedi Robinson. If you look at guys who contribute to teams' attacks, he is up there in terms of left backs. But ultimately, I went with the Estupiñán. They had a better season. To me, he had a better season. And I'm also just absolutely in love with his game. So part of this is my personal preference because it's my all-important team. Moving into the midfield, this is where things get real fun. It's a rather conservative midfield made up of James Ward-Prowse, João Palhinha, and Declan Rice. And here's why these players made this team. João Palhinha and Declan Rice were the two best ball winners in the Premier League this season. Palhinha's numbers are off the charts in terms of, tackles and things like that. And if he wasn't winning in some of the categories, Declan Rice was. The difficult part with Declan Rice is that his team didn't have a great season, but he was so good at times. They eventually got out of the relegation zone, and he's just one of the best center defensive mids in the league on a team that desperately needed everything he could give them this season because it wasn't going well. And Palhinha is just one of those guys who he's never going to get, Premier League Team of the Season recognition, but he was sensational for Fulham. Absolutely brilliant. That's why I like doing this team, is you can give guys like him recognition. And then there's James Ward-Prowse. The reason James Ward-Prowse is here is that in terms of goal involvements, his numbers, when you compare them to, what he accounted for in terms of the goals that Southampton scored, were nearly identical to the proportion of goals that James Maddison was involved in for Leicester. Think about that for a second. Now, a lot of it has to do with the fact that Leicester scored way more goals than Southampton. And we're going to talk about the Southampton part of this again when I get into where I was right and where I was wrong. But it's not just his free kicks. It's the fact that he was their offense and he's not even supposed to, he's not that guy. He's not James Maddison. And yet he was responsible for a similar proportion of Southampton's goals than James Maddison was for Leicester. And I'm always hesitant, how important can a player be when their team gets relegated? But in this case, most of that hesitancy is gone. He was asked to do so much for this Southampton team. Therefore, He's on the all-important team. Then the forwards. Kane and Salah reappear. No, Erling Haaland cannot be on this list when there are 14 other guys who could go score, 15 to 20 goals for City. Harry Kane, 100%. Mo Salah, 100%. What they did and what they mean to their teams, absolutely they're going to be on this list. Then the other guy I have is Marcus Rashford. And here's why. There is one player on Manchester United, other than Marcus Rashford, who scored more than 6 Premier League goals this season. That was Bruno Fernandes, and he had 8. Marcus Rashford carried this attack, and it wasn't a great one. And by the way, I should also say, in terms of recognition for Manchester United center backs, the fact that they were both new and both performing well made it difficult to pick one over the other. Because there's an argument Lisandro Martinez should be on the all-important team. And they also both got hurt, so it's hard to put them on Premier League team this season. They just kind of canceled each other out. But that should be recognized as well. Back to Rashford, though. He was United's attack in terms of actually putting the ball in the back of the net. And he is a big reason why they were able to get back relatively comfortably into the Champions League and be good to very good pretty much all season long. That's what I'm looking for with an all-important team guy. You've got to deliver individually, and you've got to be to sort of carry that weight for your team. And Marcus Rashford absolutely did that this season. Now onto the couple individual awards I have. Player of the season. Yeah, Erling Haaland. Yeah. No explanation necessary. This will just be another reminder. When you score goals at that rate in the Champions League and that rate in the Bundesliga, you're probably going to be able to score goals in the Premier League. And another friendly reminder, this isn't even Haaland at his most optimal, but City found a way to kind of get more of that out of him, and he is just so good that the system doesn't matter. The more interesting conversation is manager of the season. I went with Unai Emery. Aston Villa finished 1 point behind Brighton, because the other obvious choice for me is Roberto De Zerbi. You can go Marco Silva, give him some love, Thomas Frank, potentially Ten Hag, Eric or Eddie Howe for, there are plenty of options. Even Gary O'Neill. With what he did with Bournemouth. But the hesitation I have with De Zerbi is that Graham Potter deserves an awful lot of that credit too. They were flying before De Zerbi got that job. Graham Potter was the one who pretty much put that team together. Now, did De Zerbi elevate it further? Absolutely. I'm a big De Zerbi guy. This is not about trying to criticize him or say he didn't do a great job. But just compare what De Zerbi inherited to what Unai Emery inherited and where those two things are now. One of them is playing in the Europa League, one of them playing in the Europa Conference League. That's the gap. 1 point. Unai Emery is not getting enough credit for what he's done this season. And it doesn't look as pretty as Brighton. But Villa have just been awfully, awfully good. And again, if you're asking which team was in a position at the beginning of this season, I would argue it's Brighton. If you would have told me which of the, one of these two teams is going to finish in a European spot, I'm picking Brighton. And yet here they are, with Aston Villa and Brighton both headed to Europe next season. Aston Villa finished ahead of Chelsea, ahead of Spurs. I feel pretty strongly about this, that Unai Emery did the best job of any manager in the Premier League this season. There are certainly cases to be made for other guys, but I am Team Emery. Up next, I'm calling this right and wrong. We're going to look at some of the things I said and some of the storylines I was looking at the beginning of the season, some of the stuff I got right, some of the stuff I got wrong. Starting with one of the big things I got wrong. I did get the storylines for Chelsea right. In my storyline section, I had 3 storylines for every team. My 3 for Chelsea: Thomas Tuchel and the drama, Todd Boehly and what this looks like, and their inability to finish. Check, check, check. I also referenced trying to court Mauricio Pochettino in there. Ding. But I said that the worst case scenario was that Chelsea ended up in the Europa League, and that's why I got this wrong. I also don't think I deserve too much credit for identifying those issues. They were pretty obvious for everybody to see. It's not like these were new developments this season. Outside of maybe Boehly just continuing to pile on the head-scratching squad building and all of that. I didn't think they were going to end up where they were. Was not about to predict that they weren't getting into a, and weren't even going to be close to a European spot. I was way off on that. Now, in my defense, a lot of other people were too. But I didn't think any of this stuff was going to derail them the way it did. Even though the problems were there for everybody to see and I identified them. I thought it might cost him a Champions League spot. It ended up costing him a lot more than that. One of the things I got right. My worst case scenario for Everton was, I believe I said it could get worse, and it does. Nothing else needs to be said or something like that. Now, it didn't end in relegation. That was what I was implying there. But I do feel like I was consistent from the beginning that they needed to do something to change the trajectory coming out of last season. That was not a one-time survival kind of thing. And they did get worse this season because the lowest point in all of this was right near the end of Frank Lampard's tenure. I said this when they avoided relegation in the weekend roundup, and I'll say it again here. Sean Dyche is not getting enough credit for the rescue job he did. That team was averaging 0.75 points per game under Lampard, if I remember correctly. And Dyche took, 21 points from 18 games? Something like that? And I got the Dyche part of this right too. I didn't necessarily think Everton would be as bad as they were, but at no point was I surprised that things were unfolding the same way because there weren't any solutions that were actually provided over the summer. They didn't do anything to fix the problems. So I'm counting that as something I got right. The thing I got wrong above all else, some of these other ones I've been kind of saying, okay, I got this part right and this part wrong. Fulham, I said the best case scenario was a 15th place finish that helps begin to restore Marco Silva's reputation in the Premier League. Whoops. Now, I have been defensive of Marco Silva, and Eddie Howe, and Dyche are really the 3 guys I will continue to go to bat for, that I feel like just get bad raps for reasons I don't understand. But never in a million years did I think Fulham was going to finish where they did and be a top half of the table team all season. And also, Mitrovic missing an extended period of time with that suspension. Yeah, they couldn't sustain their push for Europe till the very end, but that's what we were talking about. Can Fulham qualify for Europe? Never once was there a discussion about relegation. And, it didn't look the same way it did in the championship. But they were good enough to watch. They are a very good team. And I did not see that coming. Again, I'm probably not the only one, but I will own that completely. I got Fulham way wrong. What else did I get right? My worst case scenario for Leeds was a 19th place finish with the U.S. men's national team signings flopping. I also talked about in the storylines, health, and can Patrick Bamford continue scoring goals? 19th. Now, this was obviously before Weston McKennie had joined. But McKennie and Aronson, both disappointments. Tyler Adams gets hurt. I will contend, I don't think they get... I think there's at least a 50% chance they are still in the Premier League if Tyler Adams doesn't get hurt. That's as far as I'll go, but he is that important. And Patrick Bamford, again, this team needs somebody to score goals. He didn't step up. I did get a lot of that stuff right, and basically their worst case scenario that I had laid out is exactly what happened. So, I'm counting that as right. What else did I get wrong? Similar to the Chelsea one, I laid out a worst case scenario for Leicester in which Vardy falls off a cliff. That happened. Tillmans becomes kind of a distraction or more focused on the end of his contract. That happened. And they just slide into mid-table obscurity. Yeah, that part not so much. Never thought it could get this bad. Now, that changed pretty quickly once you saw the start to the season. But even at the World Cup break, I wasn't all that concerned. I thought I was... If you would have asked me, I probably would have said my worst case scenario is going to be pretty spot on. They're just going to finish 13th, not make any noise in terms of competing for a European competition, because they had pulled themselves out of that awful start. They had beaten a bunch of the teams. It was Everton and West Ham. There was a run where they beat a bunch of teams that were kind of in the relegation race with them and jumped all of them. And then they basically just didn't win after that. So I would have, a worst case scenario involving relegation, never would have believed it. Got that wrong. And then finally, the other thing I'm crediting myself with is Southampton's slide. A couple of things I pointed out in my storylines. There had been a downward trend. That there were indicators that this was going to continue to get worse. And that's exactly what happened. Now, partially because I guess I just had no faith in Fulham whatsoever. I laid out a worst case scenario in which Southampton finished 18th. So I got the relegation part right, but not them clearly being the worst team in the league. But the other thing I pointed out that I referenced earlier is that they need somebody not named James Ward-Prowse to start scoring goals. And it just didn't happen. And so you saw the spiral coming. The big flaw was identified. And so to me, they were relegation candidates from the beginning. I'm certainly not the only person that had that, but that's where I'm giving myself this being right. Is that I pointed out, unless something changes, this is the trajectory they are on. Now, it got even worse than I thought it would. But in terms of the vibe surrounding the club and the problem that needed to be identified that just wasn't, I think my best case scenario was something about Che Adams starting to deliver. That, keeps him mid-table and out of the relegation zone. That's what we're talking about, the striker position. James Ward-Prowse should never be responsible for the same proportion of goals that James Maddison is. And that is where Southampton found themselves, and that is why Southampton were relegated with multiple games left. This was kind of coming. Unless something changed, nothing did. So I'm counting that as what I got right. I also, the other couple things, I guess one in particular, actually two. I did have a best case scenario in which Brighton, I think I said Conference League. I did point out that if Brighton can just start scoring goals, there is another level they can get to, and that is what happened. And then the other one was, did I have Newcastle as a top 4 team? No, but I did lay out a best case scenario in which Newcastle made the Europa League. I did point out that there was reason to believe what they did at the end of last season was real, and that they were on their way to becoming a very, very good team that is competing for European competition. Now, they blew that out of the water with the season they had, but that was another thing that I had in there. I like kind of going back, looking at the things I feel pretty good about, and like Fulham, things where I just completely whiffed on, couldn't even comprehend the kind of season they had. So good for you, Fulham. Completely own that one. I got that way wrong. So that is what I got right and what I got wrong. That is the Premier League season in review. I'm going to take one more break. When I come back, it is time for the weekend look ahead, setting the stage for another big week across Europe. You're watching the Touchline Talk Show. Don't go anywhere. And welcome back one final time to the Touchline Talk Show. It is time for the weekend look ahead. Similar to what I did last weekend, I'm going to lay out what is at stake in the final match day for La Liga, Ligue 1, and Serie A. So no MLS or NWSL in the weekend look ahead this week. Got plenty of time to do that starting next week. In Spain, there isn't too much going on at the top of the table. So the focus is really the relegation battle. Your games of significance: Barcelona at Celta Vigo, Cadiz at Elche, Almeria at Espanyol, Valencia at Real Betis, Getafe at Valladolid. If Valladolid win, then things get real interesting. If they don't, the relegation battle is done. But all those other teams could end up, and I didn't bother to go through all of the goal differences, but there are a bunch of permutations that open up if Valladolid win. Again, they've got to win to make this interesting, but if they do, all kinds of possibilities are opened up. So that's what to pay attention for. Again, Barcelona, and then I guess the other thing is, okay, Atletico Madrid, Real Madrid battling for second, bragging rights, but things are pretty much set at the top of the table. Ligue 1, you've got a 4th versus 5th battle going on here. Your 3 Champions League spots are locked. And you've got relegation battle. So, your games of significance: Lens at Auxerre, Toulouse at Monaco, Angers at Nantes, Lyon at Nice, Lille at Troyes, and Rennes at Brest. Monaco, Lille, Rennes fighting for those European spots. And because Toulouse won the Coupe de France, there are only 2 of them available. One Europa League, one Conference League. So Lille currently in fourth, Rennes in fifth. Obviously, if they win, they hold on to those spots. If they don't win, then all kinds of possibilities open up based on what happens in the other games. Nantes need to win and have Auxerre not win in order to avoid relegation. That's what you're looking at in Ligue 1. In Serie A, the top four are settled in terms of who's playing in the Champions League. So the question is Europa League, Conference League, and relegation. Games of note: Monza at Atalanta, Hellas Verona at AC Milan, Spezia Calcio at Roma, Juventus at Udinese. You do have your 7 teams playing in European competition, assuming nothing else happens to Juventus. What is very unclear is who is playing in what competition with those final 3 teams. Atalanta on 61 points, Roma on 60, Juventus on 59. Juventus have the best goal difference, though. So if Juve beat Udinese, they could propel themselves all the way up to 5th and get into the Europa League. And again, because Fiorentina did not win the Conference League, win the Coppa Italia, you've got that extra Europa League spot. So there is a world, had results gone differently last weekend and had Fiorentina won Coppa Italia, Juventus would be eliminated from European competition with a game to play. They could not qualify for one. But because they got some help last weekend to kind of offset their loss, they are right in the thick of this thing. They're going to play in Europe, again, assuming nothing else happens, and they could very well end up in the Europa League if they win. So Atalanta get a Europa League spot if they win. Juve could potentially get one if they draw, based on there's 3 teams, lots of different things that could go on, but Juventus, the point I really wanted to make is they do have this goal difference edge. So if they do their job and, for example, Atalanta draw, Juve have that opportunity to jump all the way up into 5th. And then you've got the relegation battle here. Spezia, Hellas Verona tied on points. Spezia have a 4-goal edge in goal difference. So hypothetically, Hellas Verona could win 6-0 against AC Milan and catch up. Obviously, that's incredibly unlikely. So if you're Hellas Verona, you are really looking for bettering the result of Spezia. And a Spezia team that has to go play at Roma, a team with things to play for to make sure they get into the Europa League. So that is good news. And then the other 2 things I wanted to mention going on this weekend, of course, the FA Cup final, Manchester Derby edition. Can Manchester United be the team to deny Manchester City a shot at the treble? Of course, United, the only English club to ever complete the treble. There's all kinds of storylines and intrigue there that it seems like we haven't really gotten in the FA Cup in recent seasons. So that's always fantastic. And then Women's Champions League final. Barcelona, Wolfsburg, also on Saturday. Really looking forward to this one. It goes back to, well, first, can Barcelona win another one of these? That's step 1. Because winning one is great. If you want to get to where Barcelona want to be, you got to win them more consistently. And number 2, this is also the second time Barcelona have played in this against a team not from France. And I'm going to bring this up again because I brought it up last time when they beat Chelsea. The discrepancy in the leagues is so drastic that at some point Barcelona need to go beat Lyon in a Champions League final. And they had that opportunity last season, and they didn't, which just further reinforces this point, that it's one thing to be the team that can beat everybody else when Lyon doesn't get there. But can you actually be the team can you be considered the best team in the world if you don't actually take down the team that you haven't been able to beat? And obviously, all Barcelona can do is get to the final. Lyon didn't get there. So now you have an opportunity to go beat this Wolfsburg team who has a storied history, is no stranger to success in this competition. But it does shift the narrative and kind of reshape it one way or another. Either it's Barcelona beat a Chelsea team that, hadn't really been there before once and hasn't gotten it done in the other finals, or it's Barcelona have no problem dismantling anybody except for Lyon. And what do you do with that? So I just keep bringing this up because it's a very interesting part of this. That as dominant as Barcelona have been, as great as they look, there is another level that they need to get to, that the Spanish national team needs to get to, when you're facing the best of the best. Because that's where they have not delivered. And basically that means, Lyon and the US and England and those kind of things. The other thing to note here, Alexia Putellas is back, has kind of been slowly working her way into action. Expect her to be at least in the 18. Maybe she starts. We'll have to see. But that is part of this as well. Obviously, she's missed most of the season with the injury. But this was kind of it was all working toward this moment. And they don't need her in La Liga. They need her for this game. And so we're going to see just how many minutes she can give them, whether she starts, what kind of impact she can make. That is all for this edition of the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to hit that subscribe button, and I will see you